independent candidate for U.S. Senate, and this is Friday, May 21st, and it's the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. And what we're going to be talking about today is something that there was a Rome Global Health Summit today in Rome, and I suspected that certain policy initiatives would not come up, although aspects of them were definitely put on the table by Chinese President Xi Jinping and others. But what is urgently needed, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been saying, is a modern health system in every nation, a global platform of medical care. And unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic has been so politicized, and people are having silly debates about matters like wearing masks and things like that. The major question of how do you prevent pandemics, how do you extend life expectancy, what is required for healthcare anyway, like clean water, electricity, certain basic needs, which really I would hope no one would be so insane as to argue about, are simply not being addressed. So I wanted to take that up this evening, and I'm happy to have a number of guests who are experts in these areas. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Dennis Speed, who is the coordinator of the LaRouche Manhattan Project, Richard Freeman, who is an economics writer with Executive Intelligence Review. We have LaMar Lemmons just joining us, who is a former state legislator from Michigan, Detroit. And we have Cal Smith, PE, that means professional engineer, who will be talking with us about some of these matters. So I'm just going to go ahead, and then we will get right into the conversation. Now, first of all, I should just say, in terms of events in the world today, I think many people have been unnerved by the situation in Southwest Asia, what many people call, unfortunately, in the British given terminology, the Middle East. And I should say that Lyndon LaRouche had been working to get peace in this area for decades. And the number one issue in this area is not what people think, which is petroleum. It is not even religion, although that plays a factor. It is water. It is drinking water. It is water for irrigation. It is clean, plentiful, abundant water to green the deserts. And because this region is a crossroads between Asia and Africa and Europe, the British geopoliticians and their co-thinkers in the US State Department have used this area to get war going as much as possible. And we just saw a little flare-up of that with Bibi Netanyahu, who is sort of like the a hand grenade deployed on the behalf of the British Empire, who staged a provocation invading the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the middle of the end of Ramadan to just be as provocative as possible. And then when you got the unfortunately predictable response from Hamas, Israel took this as the opportunity to do a 10-day bombing campaign, which destroyed 18 hospitals. I know at least 72,000 Palestinians were displaced. Last death toll I heard were 210 Palestinians killed and about 10 Israelis killed, 61 Palestinian children. And now there's finally a ceasefire, and it seems to be the policy here in the United States that you wait until Bibi Netanyahu has done what he wants, and then you finally put on some pressure for a ceasefire. It's really an unacceptable policy, including the $735 million arms deal, which was just signed by President Biden to Israel with no strings attached and no conditionalities. Nonetheless, if the United States cooperates with China and Russia in particular, this can be solved, and it can be solved in a way which benefits both sides and benefits the region. But we have to think differently. Now, the other thing I'd like to say is that President Putin of Russia just gave a rather remarkable speech, very much reminiscent of Lyndon LaRouche's emphasis on the principle of agape, of love of mankind. And he was addressing 23 new ambassadors arriving in Russia. And he said, the epidemic has proved a real test for such universal human values as solidarity, mutual assistance, and love for humanity. Imagine that, a head of state talking about love of humanity. We've heard that from some of our great presidents like President John F. Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt, but this is extremely important. So how do you demonstrate that? And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. In the course of preparing this discussion, my colleague Suzanne Klebe and I had discussions with a number of people in areas of public health and engineering. And what I think many people no longer consider today is that many of the great civil engineering projects and public works came about because of health catastrophes. And in fact, in the United States, we had already in 1798 signed into law by President John Adams something called the United States Public Health Service to deal with illnesses that occurred on the ocean, whether our sailors or immigrants coming over by boat. And by 1913, the U.S. Public Health Service actually established the first ever in the world standard for drinking water. What could be in the water, what couldn't be in the water, how do you know if it's safe, etc. I will say prior to that, there was something that really demonstrated this, and it happened in London in 1858. Apparently, they had a very hot summer, a very crowded city, and no plumbing or not anything adequate to the population or the heat. And they literally called it the Great Stink. And you had just the most foul odor and God knows what growing in the streets on all of this waste. And they commissioned a giant engineering project to actually figure out, using the water system, they built 6 different aqueducts to get all this waste out of the city and moved. So that was one of the early projects. New York City, similarly, you had the Groton Reservoir and the 2 aqueducts because of a cholera epidemic. And it was known also, they were beginning to figure out the relationship between having dirty, stinky, standing water, which is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, which can transmit disease, and public health. Now, interestingly, and what is also very, very clear is that the environmentalist movement, the Green New Deal, is exactly and explicitly counter to this. And one last thing I should say about the United States, once we began to recognize the relationship between having clean water and public health, there was a program to eradicate standing pools of water anywhere near populated areas, and we had a massive reduction of malaria in the United States. And apparently this transformation was the single biggest decrease in morbidity in the country, eradicating the ability for mosquitoes to produce. Now, what happened is we had a terrible shift in 1964 with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which was a fraudulent report on DDT supposedly causing birds' eggs to get too thin. And it was banned. And we had in 1970 Earth Day established. And instead of protecting health, and this is unfortunately also one of the things that just came out of this global summit on health, where prior to the 60s and Earth Day in 1970, the idea of environmental engineering, the idea of health, was the health of human beings, that was your number one priority. That's why you wanted clean drinking water. Well, they decided that the health of Mother Earth was primary, the health of a snail darter, a mosquito, a termite, whatever was more important than human life. And now they've come out with a term, which I'd like people to watch out for, because it's a very dangerous thing, where they're calling it One Health. And what they mean is we have to have health of people, but the health of the planet, the health of the rivers, the health of, no, there's a principle by which the universe has developed from lower order, less energy dense, non-life to life, to mammalian life, to human beings, to creativity, which is natural. And if we use our minds and we make scientific discoveries, hold on to your seats, we can actually improve nature. Human beings can improve nature. We are not an evil, cancerous blight on the planet. Now, I just want to quickly show you what's happened, the origin of this environmentalist movement, and what's happened with it lately. And I'm going to show you a couple things here. So here we go. This is a quote from Parson Thomas Malthus, who was with the British East India Company, which participated in the extermination of about, I don't know, maybe 80 million people overall in India during their century plus rule through starvation. And here is what he says. Now think about it, 1798, he writes an essay on the principle of population, the same year that the United States creates the Public Health Service. Quote, all children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread this too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. In other words, if you don't like seeing people starve to death, then come up with another way to kill them. And he said, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Okay, so don't cure diseases. You're making a terrible mistake. We should let them run their course, and that will curb the undesirable population, because everybody knows, and I think there were some British economists and geneticists later, and also unfortunately Americans, who determined that if you're poor, it's because you're genetically inferior, not because you didn't figure out how to rip everyone off like Bernie Madoff or Jeffrey Epstein. Now, here is the Washington Post. I don't know if you can see, it's a little cut off there. Pollution from farms leads to 17,900 deaths. So if you think that the environmentalist movement is still not about depopulation, here you have it. They're saying that growing meat, producing beef, producing hogs is destroying the environment. We should really cut it out, and never mind how many people will die without food. That's not something we're going to consider, but let's shut down the farming altogether. And in fact, through this Great Reset, farmers cannot get loans unless they take land out of production. You can only get a loan if you're willing to grow less food nowadays. So there's a real assault on agriculture, And here you have it from the Lancet, a British health journal owned by a Dutch company. And I think they were advocating in the Netherlands that if you're over 70, your life really isn't worth saving. And you should look on a demographic chart. There are very few people in the Netherlands who are over 100 these days. So if you're over 70, definitely don't travel there on vacation. But what do they say? Surgical obstetric and anesthesia care is one of the major contributors to climate change within the health sector. Doesn't that sound a little bit like Malthus? No surgery, no obstetricians, just if the baby comes out fine, great, and if it doesn't, too bad. No anesthesia. All right. The Lancet Scientific Journal, published by doctors and researchers from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, they worry that the climate impact of current surgical practices will get worse as life-saving procedures become accessible to the 5 billion people around the world, mostly in low and middle income countries who can't currently get them. So there you have it. So you had at one point in the United States, and it is in our Constitution, a commitment to the general welfare, the idea that engineering was inextricably linked with healthcare and public health. And in fact, people in environmental engineering had to study biology, epidemiology. This was part of the science. And the incredible breakthroughs we made in building cities, building sanitation, building water management, to a shift in the 60s and 1970, where really we had to shift over to the view that there's too many people on the planet anyway, and what really has to be saved is the pagan goddess of Mother Nature. And I would say that that doesn't consider what nature does to itself, or the fact that 65 million years ago, before any of us was alive, 99% of all species died with the dinosaurs. So human beings uniquely are in a position that we could prevent mass extinctions, and we can also develop the planet in such a way that we can have 25 billion or maybe 100 billion people or more living on this planet with more forests, more clean water, and a higher standard of living than we have currently. And that's what nations should be working together to collaborate. So I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, who will introduce the rest of the presentations.
All right, thanks, Diane. So what we're going to do is the following. We have several important presentations for you tonight. We're going to begin with one that was prepared for this meeting by Richard Freeman. Richard has been a researcher with Executive Intelligence Review for a very long time, and actually was, I met him originally out in Detroit, Michigan, back in 1972-73, where he was organizing with the LaRouche movement back then. He was one of the co-authors of a program that was put together last year, which was dealing with the issue of the larger scale 1.5 billion jobs that were needed for the globe in order to be able to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. But what he's done is to look at something very specific, which we're going to present to you now. He prepared the presentation for this meeting, so we're going to go to that presentation. We're going to follow that by a former state representative, LaMar Lemmons, who's going to tell you something which is kind of interesting, because Diane referenced before that the standard for clean water was established in the United States for the first time in the world back in 1913. But that was clearly something that got violated in Flint, Michigan. But the story of Flint, Michigan is not the story of Flint, Michigan. And Representative Lemmons is going to tell you a little bit about that. That'll be followed by Cal Smith, who has worked with LaRouche for a long time as well. And we'll get into some of the details about, not just details actually, but about the active practice of how this civil engineering and Army Corps of Engineering capability is essential to what we're referring to as addressing the entire health process. So I just wanted to catch everybody up if you happen to have joined us after Diane started. So we'll go with Mr. Freeman's presentation now, followed by Representative Lemmons and then Cal Smith.
We can't hear it.
On May 14th of this year, the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites issued the statement, "Global health security requires medical infrastructure in every country. Major industrial nations must collaborate now." I want to indicate how such a mobilization can be carried out. How will we build 29,500 hospitals with 10 million beds in Africa, Ibero-America, and sections of Asia? To do this requires a crass mobilization of the sort that we carried out in the United States during World War II, but not just by the US, but by China, Russia, India, Japan, South Korea, and the developing nations themselves. So let's look at the World War II mobilization by shifting to what actually was done in Wuhan. As the coronavirus became known in China in January, and they released the genome sequencing on January 11th, they began on the 23rd, the Chinese did, to build the Huoshanshan Hospital. This is in Wuhan, which is in Hubei province in China. And this was to contain an infection isolation capacity and was really at the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak in China. The government and the construction companies that they directed conducted an all-out mobilization. They deployed 4,000 workers, which swelled to 7,000, led by 700 project managers and dozens of engineers who together employed over 1,000 large-scale pieces of equipment, excavators, cranes, and so forth, and transport vehicles to level a 50,000 square meter site, excavating 150,000 cubic meters of earth. They laid down essential infrastructure and on top of that put down a foundation and then built a 2-story, 1,000-bed hospital. In an incredible achievement, on February 5th, 12 days after construction had started, the hospital opened for use. This is the 12-day miracle hospital. Now, what they did is they used modulated units, meaning that they had prefabricated units that they could build for everything from the headboard to the outside and so on. But the remarkable thing was 2 features. One, the infrastructure. The infrastructure usually takes 1/3 of the time to build the hospital. So they built their infrastructure in 4 days. And that meant they had to put in electricity lines, power lines, they had to put in water systems, they had to put in piping, the whole business. One of the most remarkable features, which people never see, is the incredible around-the-clock means and the competence to do that in only 4 days. Raymond Pan, who is a design engineer, discussed with EIR, and this is available in the May 21st EIR issue, some of the remarkable features of this. He built in Shunde, which is in China, the 8th largest hospital by capacity beds in the world. So he knows something about this, and he was on top of looking at this thing. And I just want to emphasize 2 features of what he said. He said, I said to him, what enabled China to do this? Because we would like to do this in the United States. The interview, while appearing this week, was actually conducted and published 1 year ago in March. And this is what he said. Let's look at how China is doing this. What it takes is you have to have the mentality to prepare for it. So you think ahead. You've got to plan ahead because, as I mentioned, when the Chinese built this, they did not start on it day one of the construction without preparation. They planned ahead. They knew that this is something they would have to deal with. You have to have people who plan ahead. They had the experience. They planned ahead and they mobilized. Those are the 3 key components. So I asked Mr. Pan, I said, well, would the Chinese work with the Army Corps of Engineers? Would it work with the United States government to reveal how they did this so we could reproduce this in America and all over the world? And his answer is, I believe so. China is willing to share. I think it's probably willing to share. Yes, I think that definitely on the state level, the Americans could find out more details than civilians could by talking to the government, and the government would share this. And that's what we need. We need US, China sharing. We need other countries sharing. Now, there's two other features I want to give as an indication of what needs to be done. Let's look at the United States. The Hill-Burton Act, which was passed in 1946, it's called the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, figured out that you needed roughly 4.5 hospital beds per 1,000 residents in any part of the United States. The US met that standard in the 1980s. We're now down to 2.4 hospital beds per 1,000 residents. So we would need, in America, to get back up to the Hill-Burton standard of 4.5 hospital beds per 1,000 residents, 600,000 beds, and 1,775 new hospitals. And this will require a tremendous amount of work, but it will also produce jobs, 770,000 new construction workers. And once this is opened, once these hospitals begin to open, they will in total need 1,400,000 new registered nurses, 292,000 new physicians, 169,000 new diagnostic related technicians, 117,000 new clinical laboratory technologists, and so forth and so on. I think you get the picture. But hospitals need something else. First of all, they need water. If you build an 800-bed hospital, it needs for the year 22 million gallons of water, and it also needs 19 million kilowatt hours of electricity to operate it. So this is a project. And we worked on this in a report. The world needs 1.5 billion new productive jobs. And in that report, we looked at what effect this and other projects, such as building a high-speed rail system in the country, upgrading our space program, building about 150 new nuclear power plants, and so forth, would have with the employment that I just mentioned from the hospitals. And we saw, if you look at this graphic, the manufacturing labor force is in green. And the manufacturing labor force today is 12.9 million jobs. By 2045, it would be 45 million productive jobs. We would rebuild every part of this country as a result of the bill of materials, the machine tools, and other things that we would need to go into this. Now, what can we do for the developing sector? Because that's the most critical feature of this plan, although building the United States, of course, has an importance, a great importance. We would need to build in Africa, Ibero-America, and Asia, 29,500 new hospitals and 10 million new hospital beds, or those hospitals will be equipped with those hospital beds. So the first wave of construction would come from places like the United States. And that means we would reopen. We've closed 30,000 manufacturing plants since 2000. We reopened them, reconvert them, just like we did with World War II. And we would purpose them for building power plants, for building water plants, for building everything that's necessary. And we would ship them along with China, Russia, India, to Africa, to Asia, and so forth. You have to consider the hospital needs in Africa. Not only do they have COVID-19 and famine in different parts of Africa, but they still have, they had 417,000 deaths from malaria in 2018. That's 94% of all the world's malaria deaths. They had 400,000 tuberculosis deaths, but do they have hospitals? No. Mali, which is a small country, has 0.1 hospital bed for every 1,000 residents, instead of 4.5 hospital beds for every 1,000 residents. They have 2% of what they need. Nigeria, which is the biggest country in Africa, one of the 10 biggest in the world, has only half a hospital bed rather than 4.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people. This is the type of thing that therefore has to be built if Africa is going to survive. But as we indicated, you cannot build a hospital just by having bricks, although we're going to have to build brick factories. But you need the massive electricity. You need the massive amount of water. And so as we start to ship them from the advanced sector, these things, the developing sector has to have and develop this capacity. But first you have them develop cement. Then you start building steel factories. Then you build machine tool factories. Then you build high-speed trains. And this is what starts to take place. So you have a reciprocating relationship as the advanced sector ships these goods to the developing sector and also simultaneously builds up its factories, reopens them, reconverts them. The developing sector starts to develop. Then the developing sector starts to develop its own capacities in this area. Remember, Africa's population, which is about 1.3 billion, 50%, almost 50%, is under 25. These are geniuses. We should develop them. We should give them these capacities. This sets off a process worldwide. This is a paradigm stepping out of collapse and stepping into the future. If we do this, think of what it would look like if people in the United States see a rundown section suddenly have a spanking new hospital with all the capacities they need. Think if we start to see pictures from Mali or Nigeria or Mozambique, which was a picture of a plane, just an African plane. And 1.5 years later, there's a new hospital, and behind it, a power plant, and next to it, a water purification plant. If we do this, then this is the new world economy. And the Bretton Woods system is not a mystery. It's not the rules of the Bretton Woods system. It's if you set off this type of economic revolution, increasing the cognitive power of people, then you simply put together a credit system that facilitates that, and that is your new Bretton Woods system working with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the environment for stopping regime change wars and for a physical, economic, and cultural renaissance. Thank you.
Okay, and we want to thank Richie for that presentation. We have several things. Now, of course, this would imply a workforce which presently doesn't seem to exist in the United States, but there's another element. Out in Detroit, Michigan, which used to be called the powerhouse, the arsenal of democracy and so forth, and Flint, which is nearby, we've had a much different circumstance, much different story. And to tell us that story, but not merely tell us that story, but also say a few other things, we've asked Representative LaMar Lemmons, who's one of the early members of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which began last year, immediately following the murder of George Floyd. It was called into being by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And the concept was, okay, if we want to address many different forms of social injustice, including in the medical field, let's look at doing that at a higher level. But in order to do that at a higher level, you first have to know where you are, you have to know something about the circumstances. And so, Representative Lemmons, we're glad that you can join us, and I'd like to hear from you right now.
Good evening to you and your guests and to all your listeners and viewers. The story in Detroit, actually goes back to the deindustrialization of the city, and of course the offshoring of all the manufacturing jobs and its massive decay. And of course, first white flight in particular, and then later on, Black middle class flight. So the city went from 2 million to we're somewhere around 600,000 to 700,000, and within a relatively short period of time, within a couple of decades. And in so doing, the municipal government had to quickly adjust its budget and its priorities. We still have the same 140 square miles of city with which you could fit many cities of comparable population, Boston, et cetera, within the city of Detroit. Detroit is very wide open, and at one point it was, of course, full of factories, tool and die, large factories, big and small, and the center of the middle class in America. So what the municipal government had to do is to adjust to this massive population loss. In any event, at some point, the city and it did make the adjustments, but the state still was covetous over certain powers and authorities that the local government had, which had now changed from a white dominated to a Black dominated municipality, which we've also seen happen in urban areas across the United States. And so one of the things that they wanted to do is to take the water from control by the locals, which are overwhelmingly African American, and place it in a larger context. But it was owned exclusively by the city of Detroit. So they, without going into too much detail, they had what's called an emergency manager system that they imposed on the city, and then let the emergency manager declare the city as bankrupt. And in doing so, the separate but related corporation of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department still was solvent. So to make the district insolvent, they cut off its largest client, which was Flint. The city of Flint was the largest single purchaser of the water from the city of Detroit, and our water department provided Flint with its water. And even though we had been notified that in several years they would transfer to a new system, which would have given the city of Detroit time to adjust, they had to expedite it under this emergency management system. So what happened is they cut off the water. Both cities were under emergency managers, and so the emergency manager decided to cut off the water system from Detroit, and then use the local water. Not instead of getting water from Lake Huron, they used it from the river within Flint, which was for a long time had been highly toxic, and from the brownfield remaining from the skeletons of the toxic materials left from the deserting factories. When these corporations left, they didn't clean up their mess. So it was very toxic in environment, and the water was toxic and was untreated. So although the water was treated that they received from Detroit, when they cut off the water system, even as they tried to purify it locally, they didn't have the necessary chemicals in it to see that it didn't leach the lead from the pipes in Flint. As a direct result, Flint was poisoned. And so that very poor, predominantly African-American city, which was already struggling to survive with a high percentage of impoverished individuals, were lead poisoned and also ancillary diseases as a direct result of lack of clean water. So Flint actually was a collateral damage to the emergency management structure set up in the city of Detroit, which had to quickly bankrupt the Detroit water system so that they can use as a rationale the takeover by the emergency manager, and then leave the city with in a financial financially insolvent, and therefore have the state take it over and create what was called the Great Lakes water system and make it a part of that and put it under their control.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Representative Lemmons. We're going to get back to you as soon as we hear the other presentations. We all have questions. I have some questions, and we'll be able to get into that in some of the dialogue. So we're going to go right now to Cal Smith, who happens to know a little bit about water management and civil engineering and other things, both in terms of getting a response to what he heard, but also the presentation he's already prepared. So Cal?
Hello. Hi, Dennis. Hi, Diane. Very good, LaMar. Jose, could you put the first slide on, please? I would just say while he's putting it up, I think we have to look at the current situation is that we're up against a financial empire, a Malthusian empire, and we're fighting them on many flanks. It's worth noting that the engineering capability, the civil engineering capability of the United States actually was developed very much under fire and under direct armed assault by the British Empire. There are other agencies in the United States that build infrastructure, but I think the Corps of Engineers development gives you a pretty good idea of how we developed this revolutionary capability. Could you put the next slide up, please, sir? As Richie mentioned, and I think it's worth just reiterating here, that Helga's Revolution, the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, has said specifically that providing healthcare and public healthcare infrastructure depends directly on expanding water, power, and food. In other words, we're going to have to build infrastructure to make all this work. Next slide, please. The first chief engineer of the United States was a man named Richard Gridley. Now, Gridley had served in the British Army in the 1750s and the 1760s, and had begun to study engineering then. Gridley was the man who built the, as you can see in the picture here, very rapidly mobilized the engineers and the forces to build a virtually British cannon-proof set of earthworks on a hill overlooking Boston. The British attacked on June the 17th of 1775. The Americans held their ground despite repeated British assaults until they ran out of ammunition. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see how the fight for Boston continued. In March of 76, 4th of March of 76, the same man, Colonel Gridley, began to build public works fortifications on Dorchester Heights. As a diversion, U.S. troops in Cambridge fired at the British troops under General Howe. When the British woke up on the night of the 5th, they were surrounded. As General Howe said, the Americans did more in one night in infrastructure than the British Army could do in 4 months. This forced a situation where the British had to evacuate Boston on St. Patrick's Day in 1776. Next slide. So what happened was that at the same time that the Public Health Service was set up in the 1790s, the Corps of Engineers was disbanded. And this caused a very large uproar throughout the entire country. So the Army Corps of Engineers was reestablished as a civilian with the idea that civilian infrastructure, water projects are an essential part of defense, not only of the nation, but of the population. So here, for example, you see a 1920s project, the Wilson Dam roadway, the Wilson Dam in the Tennessee Valley, which was built by the Corps. It was the largest concrete dam in North America when it was completed. And if you look at the next picture, you see something very interesting about the job creation program. Next slide, Jose. You'll notice this group of workers that it's integrated. In other words, here you have a situation where infrastructure is being used to create a workforce. This is in the 1920s, before Roosevelt. So you already see a tendency, you already see a commitment by this grouping to build infrastructure projects and train the population. At the same time, they're providing fresh water and hydroelectricity to build up the physical economy of these regions. Next slide. Now, I'm going to stay for a minute on the question of water. Diane mentioned that in 1798, Malthus said that there shouldn't be water projects. We should include cramped and lousy living conditions for the poor. Well, that's exactly what happened in England, is that at the beginning of the 18th century, you had landlords throwing the tenant farmers off the land. You had and what happened was that many people flung into London. There was no sanitation. People would throw their refuse each night into a pit in the alleyway, and the Thames River became flooded with dead rats, sewage, and this horrible stink. At the same time, so what happened was the stink got so bad that if you look at on the Thames River runs right in front of Parliament and Buckingham Palace. And what happened was that the British monarchy realized that the policy of starving out the poor stank, and it actually made their living uncomfortable as well. So what you see in the 1840s and the 1850s is the creation of both the British Civil Engineering Association and the American Society of Civil Engineers, who was specifically focused in the first question on this question of water. Now we go fast forward after the 1920s. No. Go back to the last one. That's fine. What happened was is that in the 1960s, in the 1950s, and the 1960s, there began to be it was a program that people may have heard of, developed out of the Navy Department by Admiral Rickover, to mass produce nuclear reactors and to train corps of reactor designers and reactor operational personnel that could be deployed after they finished their naval work into the civilian economy. The Army at the same time developed its own nuclear program. And in fact, in the 1950s, the Army's first test reactor, small modular reactor 1, was built at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, right down the river from Washington, D.C. This was the original Army Corps of Engineers Research Center. The Army Corps, they developed and designed this reactor both for defense purposes and for civilian purposes at the same time that NASA was also developing nuclear reactors and nuclear rockets to move mankind. The projections were to have mankind and a working colony on Mars by 1981. We haven't made that deadline, but that was a commitment in this period. Now, there were other applications that the U.S. saw for this Army reactor program. You go to the next slide. The first floating nuclear power plant was commissioned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And here is a picture of that ship called the Sturgis, docked at Gatun Lake, which is one of the lakes along the Panama Canal. This power plant provided power for the Panama Canal operations through the 1960s. This ship stood in mothballs for a number of years in one of our reserve mothball facilities and was finally broken up last year. But the ship itself took a reactor and put it in the hull of a leftover mass-produced Liberty ship from World War II. So the cost was actually quite low, but the benefits were actually quite high. Let's continue to the next slide. So they also move on another operation. In 1963, a 500 kilowatt nuclear reactor that produced 2.3 megawatts of thermal heat, 500 kilowatts of power, was developed in Idaho. And there you see a picture of it being towed behind a heavy Army truck. The idea was, and then the truck behind it, which you see, is where the control facility went. The idea was to deploy these militarily, to deploy them in remote areas, but the obvious implications are that the mass production of these would make it possible to set up power plants in virtually any location you wanted to. Now, this activity by the Army Corps of Engineers was killed largely by the Vietnam War, because as the Vietnam War geared up, and as more and more money had to be spent in this geopolitical action designed by the British and carried out by our friends like Henry Kissinger, the budgets and research and development in the military on this were cut back way back. If you go to the next slide. So here, for example, is how you could do it, how you could actually get one of these on site next to one of these hospitals you want to build, or a water processing center you want to build anywhere you want, Africa, any place. Is you take the modular reactor, you put it in existing aircraft, something called a C-17, you fly it to an airfield, and people should know, we've built a number of airfields in places in Africa in the name of the war on terror, but those airfields were never expanded or developed to be integrated into infrastructure projects in the country. If we can if we get out of the perpetual warfare policy, we already have toeholds in these regions that could be used to set up these reactors. So you bring the reactor in. Because they're modular, the site work you have to do is very simple. All you need is a bulldozer and a backhoe to dig a level place for the reactor. If you're in an area, for example, where Boko Haram is still hanging on while you're building these reactors and building an infrastructure, then you use the bulldozer to build a barrier around the side of the reactor so you can protect it while you're building these reactors. You go to the next slide. So this comes directly to the question of public health, because what you have is you had the Army that was building experience in infrastructure. You had the Public Health Service, which was made a commissioned officer corps and modeled on the Corps of Engineers, so that you could primarily for reasons of ensuring that the most qualified people made advancements. And then we had the coronavirus epidemic hit. What the Corps Corps of Engineers originally put out on their website was they were prepared to build between 2 and 4 million new hospital beds in the United States. And General Semonite, the former head of the Corps, came up with a program where the Corps of Engineers built a series of standard plans where you could convert a convention center, a hotel, a dormitory, or any other large public building into a COVID facility. The standard design they had would produce a low intensity or medium intensity facility so that the most sick people who checked into these places could be immediately shipped into the hospitals that could deal with the critical care cases. This mission stopped after the creation of about 16,000 beds. Here you see a picture of an actual new facility that was built within 2 weeks on the grounds of the Mission Community Hospital in Los Angeles for treating coronavirus patients. So you go to the next slide. Now, this comes into the question of fresh water once again, because we know it's not just that fresh water is, yes, we need to build a fresh water, but wastewater treatment and infrastructure around that actually can play a key role. The wastewater treatment plants itself can play a key role in combating coronavirus and other diseases. A number of universities, including Stanford University, are now doing work on, and other people have collaborated with them to develop clinical methodology where you can use well-known and proven environmental testing capability to check sewage for concentrations of genetic markers for coronavirus or for any other disease if you wanted to go in that direction. And the new technologies now allow you to pick up a concentration range from very, very small magnitudes to actually quite large magnitudes. So the technology exists for us right now to expand wastewater production, to expand freshwater production, to expand energy production, right? The only thing missing is the political will to do it and a determination for the American people to make sure that they understand what the LaRouche movement means by Glass-Steagall and how to finance this, and we can do it. We have to realize that the original British attempt to defeat the American idea of that, they lost in the American Revolution. They lost militarily in the War of 1812. They tried to support the Confederacy to destroy the Union during the Civil War. The Confederacy had an anti-infrastructure constitution. So the British gave up on direct military assaults and went for the realm of ideas. And so what they've done over a period of time is develop the idea, as we see in the Green New Deal, where people are the problem. The environment has to be saved without human beings. But in fact, that's just a plain lie. And if people will realize that it's human beings that are going to create the breakthroughs, to make new breakthroughs, to continue on this path, we can win this fight. And I think that's my last slide.
Okay.
Thank you, Jose. You were very helpful.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cal. What we're going to do now is sort of conclude in terms of our presentations with something that was actually prepared for a Schiller Institute conference that happened a couple of weeks ago by Pastor Robert Smith of Detroit. And it's self-explanatory, so I think we'll just go ahead and show that, and then we'll make a couple of comments about it.
I'm Robert Smith, Jr. I'm the chair of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated Foreign Mission Board. You have to allow every day to be a new day. In the book of Isaiah, it says that God makes all things new. And of course, in the New Testament, it talks about a spring of living water that's in your belly. And as a country boy, I know what a spring is. We had a spring in Wilcox County, and the beauty of it was that when everything else froze, a spring won't freeze. The ice can pile up higher and higher, but it keeps coming. I have been to some very low points during this pandemic. Earlier, you heard me say that I've had 57 funerals. That can get so bad to when the phone rings, you don't want to answer because you know it's going to be a thing about somebody else is gone. And today, I've just been trying to struggle through the fact that India, one of the poorest places with the poorest people, is suffering the most new virus attacks now. And that's just hard to think of. Haiti has been sanctioned, blockaded, isolated for almost 200 years. My God. The only reason Haiti has suffered like it has is because no man is an island and no half of an island can stand. Everything has been done against them to put them to where they are now. So to isolate and declare sanctions against Syria, Yemen, anybody, is to starve them to death. It is to seek to destroy them. And it may be a part of the grand scheme of things. Ted Turner said some years ago that the world population needs to be reduced to 250 million so we can have enough oxygen for everybody. And who knows what kind of schemes are going on to get that reduction and to reduce the population of India, reduce the populations in South America, and even here in the urban United States. I do know this. I do know this. There is a God, no matter what you call him, no matter how you approach him, whether as a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian, God has a time limit set. And when that time comes, God will move and save his people because God is always on the side of the poor.
Now, it's the case that the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites that has recently been formed comes out of earlier actions that had been done by Lyndon LaRouche, the late Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman who was one of the co-founders of the Schiller Institute. Just want to refer to something that some people may remember because Pastor Smith referenced Haiti, which is one of the other areas where the committee would like to do work. You may remember back on January 12th of 2010, there was an earthquake that killed 300,000 persons in Haiti. And back at that time, LaRouche issued a statement, which was called LaRouche Demands Urgent U.S. Action to Prevent Rainy Season Devastation. And it stated, Lyndon LaRouche today, this was in February of 2010, issued an urgent call for the United States to send the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to work with the Haitian government to help relocate up to 1 million Haitians now homeless and living amid the rubble of shattered Port-au-Prince in the aftermath of the January 12th earthquake that killed some 300,000 Haitians. Now, this action itself was actually not unlike and not outside of the history of the United States in general with respect to Haiti. LaRouche defined some other elements of this program, which I'll talk about for a moment. But let's remember that the island of Haiti had been the scene of the first successful slave revolt in all of history. And that was the revolution that was begun in 1791 by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. That revolution went on until January 1st, 1804. And Toussaint was the leader of that. He collaborated in that revolution, little known today, with Alexander Hamilton, who was a supporter of the Haitian Revolution, which Thomas Jefferson was not. And he helped, that is, Hamilton helped to co-write the Constitution of Haiti. That it was the ultimate time when the revolution was concluded in 1804, which was still the time in which the United States, of course, had slavery and had slavery until 1863 to 65, created a kind of challenge throughout that part of the globe. And it challenged the very ideas, not merely with respect to slavery, but with respect to the whole notion of what humanity was. The American Revolution and that portion of the Haitian Revolution, which we are just referring to, are one portion of the outlook from which ideas like civil engineering and public health services were the content of the American Revolution. It was not the mere political battle between 1776 and 1783, or rather it was this battle, which was started by Hamilton, the same Alexander Hamilton who famously had a political enemy, Aaron Burr, who created a bank, the Bank of Manhattan, against the Bank of New York of Alexander Hamilton. And he used a scam around a water project. The idea that New York, which was suffering a cholera epidemic, needed a new system to bring fresh water into the city, which was true. And Aaron Burr, financed the Bank of Manhattan by telling people he was going to build a new system, canal system, to bring fresh water into the city. That was a lie, but there was a basis for him to be able to assemble enough capital to begin to challenge the plans and projects that Alexander Hamilton was putting forward with George Washington and others through his Society for Useful Manufacturers based in Paterson, New Jersey, and also through his 4 documents, the report on manufacturers, public credit, and the 2 reports on the National Bank. So when we're talking here tonight about this idea of civil engineering, we're talking about the ideas of public health, we're talking about the kind of thing that Representative LaMar Lemmons has outlined to you. These are battles which are familiar to people that understand the American system and understand that the concept of internal improvements, of public infrastructure, of new economic platforms and technological platforms are at the very core of the independence of the people. So just wanted to add that in, and now we'll go to our discussion and just see, Diane, if you have any particular response to what we've talked about. I don't know if Representative Lemmons is still there with us, but if he is, we'd certainly like to get him back in the discussion. But let's go to you first, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Right. It does look like he's still there.
Okay, great.
One of the things I was just reflecting upon hearing about the situation in Detroit and the question of water and so on. And I know one issue, and we saw this down in Texas with energy, is you have this price gouging where people rack up huge amounts of debt. In the case of Texas, they just jacked up the price arbitrarily because there was a shortage, like what Enron did. Or you have people who've been out of work, et cetera, and water is a basic condition of basic public health. So you're cutting off people's water if they can't pay. Now they're saying, well, maybe we're going to forgive all this debt, which I think is well and good. But just the fact that forgiving debt is seen as a be all and end all sort of the solution is really part of this Wall Street disease we have in the money, where it's like the country, they're just shifting money around and they're saying, oh, don't worry, we're going to send you a check. Don't worry, you're going to get a little bonus or you won't have to pay this. But meanwhile, the actual standard of living of what you should have has not been changed at all, or it's gotten worse. And I used this phrase last week, and I'm going to keep saying it until I feel like more Americans understand what I mean, which is this saying, selling your birthright for a bowl of pottage. That is, once people have been kind of beaten down and conditioned to accept things that never should have been accepted, then someone comes along and offers a little present, whatever it is, a little relief, and people accept that, because we should be building totally new, modern cities. And if we were building things in the way that Rich Freeman described, like to create a fully modern healthcare system in every nation, emphatically including the United States, probably cities like Detroit would be, people would be coming back into these cities to become part of a productive workforce. And you'd need a functioning city with a high standard of living. So I just wanted to say this because I think we cannot be fooled by the idea that money, one way or another, is a solution to this. And I think fairly soon, unless something has changed dramatically, we're going to have a situation like Weimar Germany, where people may have wheelbarrows full of money and they won't be able to buy a dozen eggs because they won't exist, and the cost will be out of control. I mean, we have really caused terrible hyperinflation with all these bailouts. So it has to get down to the physical standard of living at a certain point.
Make one comment on what Pastor Bob and Dennis said about Haiti
Sure, good.
and Lynn's call in February of 2010, because in fact plans were drawn up for the reconstruction of Port-au-Prince, and they were stopped by a directive from above. Those plans were drawn up, they were ready to go. The bill of materials was laid, was all ready to go. We never found out who stopped it, but it was stopped. And I think that's where, and I think what you had said, Dennis, about the history, you and I had known this too, that I think that Haiti has been singled out in the same way the Americans were, because of their fighting spirit and because of the revolution that they had. So, you know, I just wanted to say that.
Okay, I got
I
you.
think that's useful to know.
Let's see if Representative Lemmons has anything he wants to comment one way or the other.
Certainly, in terms of Haiti, the U.S. was very much part of the embargo on Haiti. And of course, you know, the U.S. invaded Haiti. The U.S. gave Haiti Papa Doc and Baby Doc. And the U.S. was very much working with the European nations to continue the embargo and stop the development of Haiti. So let us not delude ourselves to think that somehow the United States has clean hands when it comes to Haiti.
That's correct.
And not only
Yes.
but in fact, Randall Robinson was when under the Clinton administration. So you can see I'm not a partisan person. So under the Clinton administration, he was on a hunger strike to stop the return of the refugees, people who are escaping the murder by the various factions and dictatorship in Haiti, and they were coming to the U.S. and they were turning them around. At the same time, they were letting Cubans into the United States. And Randall Robinson went on a hunger strike, and he was successful because Clinton reversed some of his policies as a result. But back to the Legionnaire and the water problem in Flint, because it wasn't just the lead, it was also chloroform bacteria, it was Legionnaire or Legion,
Legionnaire's disease.
Legionnaire's disease. It totally depreciated the housing. Can you imagine who wants to buy a home and even a starter home in the community who has no water? So it had tremendous economic impact on the already city that had been largely already deserted. And meanwhile in Detroit, we had a similar water crisis as they were cutting off, they were charging people for water rates where the average citizen, many of the citizens in Detroit could not afford the water without tremendous sacrifice. And they were confiscating their property. They were attaching the water to the tax bill and then foreclosing, having a tax foreclosure where the people could make their property tax payments, but they couldn't afford the water bill. It's not the water that they would use. It was this tremendous sewage bill that was being attached to there, as well as what they call drainage fees. That is, they were charging the citizen for the rainwater that hits their roofs and any impervious subjects, their garages, their driveways, any impervious. And so they had to pay an additional tax.
Can I just ask, so they had like some kind of a meter system to measure water that was leaving the property?
They would, no, actually it took from above, they took a photo and figured out how much, and then they just attached it accordingly.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm
Mhm.
sure someone somewhere was placing a side bet on that probably contributed to the
Yeah,
skyrocketing derivatives
Well,
level.
exactly. Somebody's probably right on the side bet as they do in Wall Street.
Mm, mm, mm.
Wow.
I have one question for you because you referenced the fact that both Flint and Detroit were under management systems. Now, some of us who go back long enough in New York remember the Emergency Financial Control Board that took over in New York City way back. I'm talking about 1975, so that the city council and the mayor's office really were under receivership. And actually went on in New York. A lot of people don't know that, for 33 years. You know, and that's how that whole. But of course, New York was a different thing.
Yeah, because the big difference is because we had an emergency manager system, but they were limited. So they created this super all-powerful czar, and to be called the emergency manager. And so he was only responsible to the governor.
Ah, right. So in other words, he didn't answer at all to the city council, the mayor whatsoever.
Right. And he would go to them and try to get them to do things in agreement, just because from my estimate, they knew that what they were doing was really unconstitutional for a lot of different reasons. So they would, if they could get the elected body to go along, which ironically, in the case of Detroit Public Schools, we did not, but Flint did. So their city council, so later on when they were suing, even though the council had no power, even though there was just a rubber stamp, they were going to do it either way, the emergency manager had the power to do it with or without the council. He would love to have the council, so any mistakes, he can say, well, your elected officials agreed. And so the Flint City Council made a terrible mistake in going along. I was the president of the Detroit Public School Board, and we refused to go along with any of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just want to ask you another question, and this goes actually be asked to you and Cal, because I'm interested in this. Your father was also a state legislator, correct? Am I right, Representative Lemmons?
Oh, yeah, my father became a state legislator after me.
Right.
Actually, we served one term together. We have term limits and a lifetime term limits in Michigan. And so, so I served, and then I got my father to come in and to the adjacent district. And so we both served together. And then I served also, my wife and I served on the Detroit School Board, 7-member board, and 2 of them were named Lemmons.
Well, now here's why I ask it in part, because I believe that your father moved into Detroit around about 1950 or something like that, or a little bit earlier than that.
You're right, a little bit earlier than that. Yes.
A little bit earlier than that. So that means that he was there and he would have seen the arc of Detroit, okay, over a 70+ year period. You know, in 1961, Detroit as a city, had the highest living standard for people of any city in America. And you know, I'm posing something to both you and Cal in terms of the question that you brought up earlier, which is the expanse of Detroit is such that you could have several cities inside of it. You had the old infrastructure, the factories, even up until 2005, 2006. As you know, Representative Lemmons, we were doing stuff with around the whole auto question, trying to still save that, right? And I'd just like to have you comment, and then maybe Cal could comment about what needs to be done now in this country when we're looking at these questions of the workforce, reindustrialization, and so forth. Go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, you know, what you guys advocated, and by the way, Danny Davis either dropped today or is going to drop next Tuesday. And well, he must have already dropped it because we have a bill number, and it's HR 3339. 3339. 3 3s and a 9.
Mhm.
HR, and which calls for a $5 billion national infrastructure bank for the redevelopment. And that's what needs to happen. We need to build up all the roads. We need to bring the industrialization back, even the 21st century industrialization. We need to retool the entire economy. And Detroit is well suited to absorb some more population and well suited to with the potential for the infrastructure to be built on top of the old infrastructure that used to exist.
Okay, Cal, you have any comment?
Well, it's interesting. Just as sort of a kind of a side note, the current budget that the administration proposed for infrastructure allegedly increases the budget, but one of the things they did was propose a 13% cut for the Corps of Engineers. So I think that the way there's a couple of ways to approach this. One of the things is that agencies like the Corps of Engineers and the American Society of Civil Engineers have issued pretty clear statements state by state on the kinds of infrastructure projects that need to be done. I think what former Surgeon General Jocelyn Ehlers proposed as a youth corps for coronavirus activity in cities could be applied directly to the question of building infrastructure. In other words, we know from our own experience with the Roosevelt experience and with the Kennedy experience that infrastructure, industrialization, scientific expansion, and education go hand in hand. So if you can put a focus on this and the question of increasing, look, infrastructure also, hold on a second, I'm sorry. Infrastructure also has a direct effect on, pardon me. The fact is that in any honest environmentalist would support, for example, the expansion of the space program. And Kraft Erica was very clear on this on 80s, one of Lynn and Helga's friends. He said that if God wanted us to be a spacefaring species, he would have given us a moon. And he did. And the thing that we know about scientific advance is that as you increase the technological capabilities, your scientific capabilities, you can create a situation where existing infrastructure platforms, as you increase your rate of research and development and energy flux density through the economy, that your past obsolete forms of infrastructure become a raw material source for one of the raw material sources for your new systems. So what you pose to people is this is look, we have one Earth. We want humanity to develop. We want our Earth to be a garden. The way to do it is to increase the energy flux density, the efficiency of all of your physical productivity, and your scientific capabilities. If you bring that conception to bear on the development of infrastructure, and you recruit youth into that idea, and in fact, we could set up training camps for, big projects where when a young man or woman finishes high school, they get recruited to one of these camps. They have to put their cell phone in a locker for 6 months because we don't have time for them to text or spend all their time on texting or babbling on the cell phone, and we move with these projects. You have an opening for that right now with the Biden administration that says they support the space program. Well, they may be their reason for supporting it is geopolitical. They want to quote unquote beat the Chinese. But what if you pose the question of scientific development as a way that we just been talking about to increase your capabilities of making infrastructure, increasing industrial capability, and by doing that, you're eliminating less efficient processes. So you get a whole package where you present this to kids and you say, this is a future. Why don't we go in this direction?
All right. We're running out of time at this point. Sorry. Yeah. So Diane, I think we're going to go to you because we probably need to do a summary statement at this point. I think that right, just because of our time problem here.
Yes. Well, first, I'd really like to thank everyone who participated, and I hope that you can be on again, Representative Lemmons and Cal, because this is a lot. I've gotten comments from people saying how much they really appreciate the presentations, all of them, and also the story on what happened in Detroit, this water story, which people don't know, and they found it really devastating. What I would like to say in closing is, you saw from some of the pictures that Cal showed of what the Army Corps of Engineers was capable of doing. What the Chinese have done is that the conditions that we accept as normal in this country, with bridges collapsing, trains wrecking if they go over 40 miles an hour, drinking water that's undrinkable, none of this is necessary. If we were to unleash the creativity and skilled potential of the people we have now, we could transform things. We wouldn't have the workforce that we need. That's why this youth corps is so critical. But I just would really urge people to unleash your imagination and not allow your thinking to be dictated by what you have seen in your lifetime. Because now, unless you're over 65 years old, you cannot even remember a time when the United States was remotely productive. So nothing that we've seen in the last 65 years should be taken as a determinant for where the nation can go today. And I think what we see with the pandemic, what we see with the war danger, if we don't change our thinking on this, then we very well may see the end of the human race. So that's what I'd like to say.
All right, well, I guess I'll just, on behalf of the dialogue on Friday symposium, just say a couple things. Tomorrow, there will be another presentation on the LaRouche organization site. Hussein Askari, who was one of the authors of the report extending the new Silk Road to Southwest Asia and Africa, will be giving a presentation. I'll be at 2 o'clock tomorrow. And that presentation is intended to directly address what has been going on in the Palestinian Authority in Israel and so forth. Let's point out as we begin to go off here, that's a 2 million persons. It is one of the most densely populated pieces of land that is there. It's about 50% of the people are under the age of 18. There's 80% unemployment, or 50% unemployment. There's like 80% youth unemployment. You're talking about a circumstance where 17, 18 hospitals have been destroyed. When we talk about this issue of development and infrastructure, and we talk about this idea of the coincidence of opposites, there is certainly a circumstance that requires that approach. And so Hussein Askari will be presenting that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and Diane and I will be co-hosting that, so you can catch us there tomorrow. And certainly, as has already been said, we want to continue these dialogues. If you enjoyed this, please write to us, get this out, get it up on your own platforms, tell people about it. We do this every Friday at 7:30, and we welcome comments and suggestions. So on behalf of the Friday Symposium with Diane Sare, we want to say good night to everybody and hope that we'll see you here again next week.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.